Fundraising everywhere.
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 Fundraising everywhere!
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to ACEVO's online event discussing how we as a sector can ensure an equitable and inclusive response to this COVID-19 crisis. I'm Vicky Browning. I'm Chief Executive of ACEVO, and I'm going to be hosting our online session today with Christiana Rixon, who is ACEVO's Head of Policy. We're really grateful to Nikki Bell and Simon Scriver from Fundraising Everywhere, who've offered to let us use their fantastic online conferencing platform for free, and are also behind the scenes making sure, we hope, that the tech runs smoothly. I have got two teenage boys who have been forbidden from using the Wi-Fi for 2.5 hours. It's as if I've asked them to cut off a limb, but we're trying to make sure that things don't drop out. So fingers crossed the Wi-Fi holds up. Now, today, we were supposed to be launching the ACEVO and Voice for Change England report into Making Diversity Count. This is something we've been working on for a year now, looking at race, equity and racism in the charity sector. And today was launch day. However, with this COVID-19 crisis hitting us, we've decided that what we really want people to do when we launch this report is to read it, to respond to it, to absorb it, and to change the way they behave. And we're not convinced that now is the time for people to have the bandwidth really to respond in the way we would like them to the report. So we've agreed to postpone the launch of the report until people have a little bit more capacity to be able to engage with it and give it the attention that we believe it deserves. But we wanted to make sure, nonetheless, that we kept a focus on equity and inclusion at this difficult time, because this is not something that we should just be worrying about in good times. This is an issue that all charities should be weaving into their work at all times. So today we thought we would focus on how, as a sector, we need to respond to this crisis in an equitable and inclusive way. And I do want to say right up front, thank you so much to Christiana for pulling this together in a very, very short space of time, and to our speakers for agreeing to join us really in a flash, actually. Everything's moving very quickly and everyone is responding brilliantly. Now, the outbreak of COVID-19 has transformed charities' plans and priorities, and everybody, all of us, want to ensure that the work we're doing over the coming months is as good as it can be to provide support to the services, support and services to the people that we work with. But in order to serve all people and all communities, we need to be sure that the programmes and processes we create over the coming months are equitable and inclusive. And I've already talked about the need to move with speed, but it's important that moving with speed does not negate the necessity of being inclusive. Because although we will all be impacted by COVID-19, we will not all be impacted equally. So I'd like now to invite Christiana to introduce our speakers, to outline how the day is going to work. Well, it's not a whole day, it's only a couple of hours, but also to let you know, people who are watching, how you can engage with us and how you can interact with us and the speakers, because we want to try and make this as engaging as possible for you. So Christiana, do you want to just give us an overview of what's going to happen?
Sure. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you for joining us. So we have a 2.5 hour session. We've got 4 brilliant speakers, and they are going to be almost like 4 mini podcasts, if you ever listen to our podcast, a conversation with either me or Vicky and the interviewee talking to us about what we can do to make our response more equitable. So we have Vanda Vaporska, who's the director of the Equality Trust, Becca Bunce, a human rights activist, Mubin Haq, who is the CEO of the Standard Life Foundation, and Camille St. Omar Donaldson, who's an organizer at Charity So White. So we'll learn a little bit more about them as we go. So you'll be able to see underneath my head probably as you're watching. There's a comment box. If you have a question for our speakers, then pop it into there, and we will keep an eye on that. So there'll be about a 15-20 minute conversation between either me or Vicky and the person being interviewed, and then after that we're going to open it up to you guys. So if you've got any questions, throw them at us and we'll try and answer as many as possible. Don't worry about trying to take notes, because there's probably going to be lots of wisdom, lots of quotes, but we're going to record this and put it up live. So this will be available if you have to dip in or out, or if you don't catch everything first time. Brilliant.
Back to
Hand
me.
it over to Vicky now. Yeah.
So slick. So I'm very happy to welcome our first speaker today. So we're going to talk about how what coronavirus shows us about inequality in our society, and I'm really delighted to welcome Wanda Wyborska. She is executive director at the Equality Trust, which is the national charity that campaigns to reduce social and economic inequality. She's a visiting research fellow at the University of York, trustee of Equally Ours, Red Thread, and recently ACEVO, which is marvellous, and she's a governor at West Green Primary School. She was also a founding trustee of United Kingdom for Referees. Not referees, that's football. Refugees is actually who you work with. Wanda has over a decade of experience working in the trades union movement, leading on equalities, social mobility and education policy, and is an experienced campaigner. So welcome, Wanda. When we announced on Twitter that we were going to run this event, somebody responded, what we need is for charities to survive. Many are facing financial and staffing crisis. The job of sector leaders is now to demand prompt and large-scale government action. Worrying about whether it's inclusive is rather missing the point. This really kind of highlighted to me, and I wondered if we could just start off with, what are we going to say back to this? Why is it important for us to be talking about equity now?
Well, I think it's never been so important. When we're thinking about the effects that charities are having, the fact that, small charities and charities that are working at grassroots level are seeing their services cut, are going into crisis at the moment. Really, those charities are doing the job of the state. And when you look at a lot of those charities, a lot of their beneficiaries are those marginalised communities. So whether they're Black or Asian, whether they're in economic inequality or social inequality, or people with health issues, all of these issues are important. And I think to start saying that, we're not going to focus on inclusion is dangerous, because it's essential to bring the right services to the people who need it most at this time. Because when we look at the social determinants of health, when we look at the public health problems that we have right now, then we are not all, as you say, affected in the same way. The impact will be disproportionately on the poor, because they tend to have more comorbidities as well, more underlying conditions. So, and we also know that disproportionately Black and Asian people are in those groups because of the range of income inequality that we see. So all of these things are interlinked. And I think what's going to be one of the themes of the session today as well is interlinkage, is the way that all of these issues are linked, whether it's housing, whether it's health, and at the bottom of all of this and underlying all of these issues is undoubtedly the issue of economic inequality, but also who is at the bottom, who is going to suffer more. And it's no surprise to know that it's disproportionately, whether we're talking about single mums, whether we're talking about people who are in precarious work or precarious housing, it's generally disproportionately Black and Asian communities.
And so, these are people who are already disadvantaged. A lot of these people are already disadvantaged. How will COVID-19 exacerbate that?
Well, as we've seen, this is an indiscriminate virus. We have, coming back to the social determinants of health, we will see the effects of the lack of resources. So, people won't be able to flee to their second homes in the middle of the country, or they won't be able to, they will be in a very pressured position already, whether it's in terms of health, whether it's in terms of economic security. So if we look at housing, one of the things that our young people told us last year was that if they're in precarious housing, or they're in very, there's 6 people in a family and they're in a very small flat, they tend to go out onto the streets, understandably. And then all sorts of things happen as a result of that. It's not just about looking at one issue and trying to solve that. It's the holistic approach of how people live, how people are forced to live, the problems with the economic precarity that we have, and also things like discrimination in the workplace means that a lot of Black and Asian people do become self-employed or do set up their own businesses, small sole traders, rather than continuing to work in some of those workplaces. And all of these things are coming together in a sense. All of those pressures that discrimination and racism have caused within workplaces and within systems are all coming together in one place during this attack.
And if these, as these inequalities are kind of already inbuilt into our society, which we know, and given how fast everything is changing, what are some of the things that we need to be doing or thinking about as a sector to ensure that the responses that are being put into place actually tackle some of this stuff, rather than do what I fear will happen, is just carry on as normal, which will continue to embed these injustices and these inequalities, because nobody's actually thinking about it. What should we be doing as a sector to bring these issues to the fore as decisions are being made at speed?
Well, I think the key thing, and the sector has been moving towards this, but probably not fast enough, is speaking to your beneficiaries, speaking to the people that you are trying to support in this, because they will have the answers. We have to have less of this command and control. And I understand there is a need for speed, clearly, and people will be keen to make very fast decisions. But if you make a fast decision and it's the wrong decision, then that really can do more damage than good. So I would say speak to your beneficiaries, speak to the communities, but also this is a time for larger and smaller charities to come together to see what they can do jointly, to see how we can support the sector to make the right decisions, so that we are not just seeing the larger charities being able to respond very quickly while some of the smaller charities are basically going to the wall, because at that point we will lose those connections with the very people that charities are trying to support. I think we need to learn the lessons of silos. So again, the impact, if you take a walk through somebody's life and the points in their life where they need that support, or we look at housing, we look at the universal credit system, we look at a whole range of different issues, health, education, and where the points of discrimination really have most effect, then looking at how we are dealing with those issues and looking at how we can support other organisations that are working in those areas. I think it's really essential for the sector to come together, and I'm really pleased to see a lot of fantastic leadership out there happening. But those twin things of not working in silos, but also keeping our grassroots organisations going and speaking to the people who are affected the most.
And in terms of, ACEVO's constituency, obviously is charity chief execs. I know that on this event today, I think we've got a real mixture of different people. But if you're specifically talking to leaders of charities, the sort of thing that you want to see from them, then I'm hearing is listening and partnership, collaboration. Are those the kind of two key things then that your message to chief executives at the moment would be?
I think that's absolutely essential, and I think where they possibly can, to financially and in other ways support smaller charities if they can. Okay, great. So do we have any questions coming in from people in who are viewing? I'm just looking at different 17 different screens. Not yet, I'm told. Great. Okay. So please do send in any questions or comments that you have, and we will it magically appears on my screen, and then I will share it with you. Vanda, is there anything that we haven't covered that you think that we should be raising today? Well, I think this is something that probably most of us don't want to think about, but as we head into a long hot summer, I think we need to be prepared for potential social unrest, and what we need to keep our eye on are the powers that are given to the state as well, because we know from experience which communities are disproportionately affected by increased police powers. And I think it's really essential that in the midst of trying to deal with the day-to-day and the very real realities of food banks shutting down, that we also keep our eye as people in the sector on the powers that are going through Parliament and how they will affect a lot of people, to make sure that we are holding politicians to account for what they're doing, and keeping an eye on what's happening with human rights. The other thing I would say is that, you know, what we're talking about, structural discrimination and structural inequalities, are all about power. And we're going to see very new dynamics of power here, not just in the political system, but people's power over each other. You know, I mean, I've seen horrific things that, you know, of landlords kicking people out, of a whole range of different abuses that people are getting away with. And I think we need to be very mindful of how these changes in power dynamics can affect people as well, and especially people who've already suffered discrimination in their lives. But this will have a real issue, a real impact on people.
And the COVID-19 bill, I think, is being pushed through Parliament in the next couple of days. So I think that scrutiny, I think, is really important. And I know that there are MPs who are particularly anxious to put time limitations on the measures as well, because I think that is going to be a crucial factor. So we had a question through about infrastructure bodies. What do you think that infrastructure bodies within the sector should or could be doing to help? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think infrastructure bodies have really stepped up. You know, the recent collaboration on asking the government to include charities within their provisions for businesses. You know, we are employers, clearly, is a really fantastic example. I think it's being a hub for your organisations and listening to members and taking their views to the relevant authorities or spreading them beyond within the sector, because it's a very difficult job for us all to know what's happening with our other partners and with the rest of the sector. So I think infrastructure bodies are doing a really good job in bringing a lot of the different impacts of this through to a much wider audience and amplifying the voices of their members. So I think it's really kind of keep on keeping on. But again, it's listening and it's making sure that your members, all of your members, have got the support that they need.
Thank you. Yeah, and there is, as you say, I mean, there is a huge amount of work going on within the infrastructure system. We're all kind of talking to each other several times a day, and there is a real coordinated effort to work with DCMS to persuade Treasury of the importance of supporting the sector financially with swift, substantial and simple funding, as well as the sense that, I mean, on Friday we had a very welcome acknowledgement within the Prime Minister's questions about the role of the sector, and then yesterday when they started talking about volunteers and activity, we were nowhere. But we are hopeful that more will come out today, particularly around our role within volunteering, and also this, we are absolutely foot to the pump on trying to get the funding that the sector needs in order to be able to survive, because otherwise if we're not here, we can't help. So yeah, that is all cracking on. But it is about also making sure, I think we are really trying to make sure that we're including as many voices as possible, so that we are talking to infrastructure bodies right across the spectrum of the sector to make sure everybody is included. So another question there: Do you think COVID-19 will change how charities work long term?
I think it has to. I think that, you know, already we're seeing changes in how we work. We're seeing changes to digital. I mean, this very event is an example of how we're changing. I think it's fundamental to think about how we change our frontline work as well. But I think it's really challenging leadership. I think that innovation will come out of this. There are, you know, I don't say there are silver linings, but we have to be innovative about the way we change. And I think for some in the sector, that change is long overdue. I think the people that we engage with and how we engage, we're going to have to think more broadly about who our audiences are and how we engage with them as well. But I think also this will obviously bring out more thoughts in terms of mergers, in terms of how organisations work together, because we are building those foundations of working together. And these times call for a more agile lead and collaborative leadership. I think those in the sector who, you know, forge ahead and furrow, you know, plough their own furrow without thinking about how they work with other organisations are really going to have to rethink that as well.
Thank you. And another question: how does our sector, especially those who work with young Black, Asian, minoritized ethnic people, keep young people and their communities safe? So you mentioned, you know, things could get tricky later on in the summer. You know, how can we be helping to keep our communities and our young people safe?
Well, I think the primary issue really, and I can't believe I would ever have to say this in the 21st century, is keeping people with their basic needs. So ensuring that communities are not isolated, that people have food, have supplies, have medical supplies that they need, but also that they are keeping themselves safe. It's incredibly difficult to you know, I can imagine it's incredibly difficult to work with young people at this point, because face-to-face contact, all of the things we usually do, the gatherings, the bringing people together for their mental health as much as anything, I think is really essential. But we have to find new ways. Unfortunately, a lot of young people who do have access, obviously I'm aware that not all young people have access to technology, but where they can, we need to find a way to use this for good, to make sure that this is the way that people can have contact with each other, that people can feel a sense of solidarity, that we can offer those services either over the phone or, you know, in many different ways. And, you know, we have to be more innovative. But, you know, I'm sure there are lots of youth organisations out there who have got lots of innovative plans. And again, it's about sharing. You know, how can we support that? We do a small amount of work with young people, and what we're looking at now is how can we support other organisations with the small amount of funding we have to ensure that their work carries on. So again, it is, you know, I keep coming back to working together. If you're working in communities and there are 2 or 3 organisations, then how can you work together, and how can you share best practice?
Yeah, and I think the communication is such an important part of this, not just communicating between us as charities, but actually us being a conduit for information. I think one of the things I'm finding most with sort of friends, neighbours, family is people just don't quite know what's going on. They don't understand. They feel they're getting mixed messaging. And I think there is something about a role for us as a sector in helping to clarify. I mean, as much as we know what's going on, but helping to sort of clarify some of those messages and perhaps reinforce some of them as well. I have got another question here. Today, there will be a debate about the coronavirus bill, which proposes huge changes to the CARE Act. How do we ensure the system can respond to COVID-19 without further entrenching this inequality? Do you think that are there MPs going to be debating this who will have the inequality agenda in mind? Or is there anything else we need to be doing to try and ensure that they do?
I mean, we work with a range of MPs across the political spectrum. I think one of the hard things about this is that people have been very reluctant to really see the evidence and understand the evidence and admit there's been a lack of political will about admitting that social and economic inequality have huge impacts, that we have had high levels of inequality for decades in this country, and it's basically stripped our resources bare, and it's caused intergenerational inequality that has continued from generation to generation, which is why we have, you know, 7 million households who don't have any savings or, you know, anything to fall back on. And this means at a time like this, it's really, really crucial that the government steps in, as they've shown a little bit of leadership in doing. But it does mean that our private resources and our economic resources are depleted. And of course, people at the bottom of that are suffering more because they don't have those levels of safety or wealth or assets to fall back on. The problem is that, again, it's coming back to silos. We know that in countries with high levels of inequality, we have higher levels of these socially determined ills. So poor mental health, poor physical health, teenage pregnancies, obesity, high levels of incarceration, higher levels of violent crime. All of these things that our stretched systems and our charities have been trying to deal with as a consequence of high levels of inequality. So, you know, we didn't put the roof on when the sun was shining, and we are now at really at rock bottom in terms of this, and that means that we've got a huge, ever bigger hole to dig ourselves out of. And I suppose what I'm saying to politicians is that take the first step and recognise that inequality is playing a huge part on this. We are seeing, rich people buy ventilators. We are seeing people, the increase in the use of private jets is happening because people are going off to their bunkers. Meanwhile, we have NHS staff who can't get food because by the time they've got to the supermarket, people have stockpiled. I mean, if this doesn't show us the absolute glaring problem of inequality, then I don't think anything does. And so I think, politicians have not looked at inequality in the sense of saying we need an inequality reduction strategy across government. We need to take into account inequality with all of our policies. And I think now more than ever is a time to do that, because that will help the people that we are trying to support.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you so much, Vanda. That's a great start, and some really, really strong message there. And actually, it is a fight that we need just to keep fighting throughout this crisis and beyond. I'm going to hand over to Christiana now. So thank you to you, Vanda. Christiana, I think I'm going to hand over to you, and you're going to introduce our next speaker.
Yes, thank you very much. So our next speaker is Becca Bunce. Becca is a human rights activist, and her work and research focuses on enabling people with lived experience to participate and lead in social change. She's a trustee at John Ellerman Foundation and is currently undertaking a PhD studentship in public policy and design thinking at King's College London. Until September 2019, Becca co-directed the award-winning law-creating IC Change campaign, which calls on the UK government to ratify the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women. Her work has received many accolades. Notably and very impressively, she was cited as an inspiration by President Obama for her work on violence against women and disabled people's rights. And Becca was recently named as one of 150 leading women in the University of London's history. That is a very impressive biography, Becca. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's jump straight in. So as you can tell from the biography, you're a very successful campaigner. A few years ago, you wrote a series on leadership for ACEVO for our 30th anniversary. And one of the articles, and in the article, which was on collectivism, you wrote about redesigning tools that allow a range of people to engage with your work. How do you think this relates to the current situation with everyone suddenly moving to online remote working?
So at the moment, I think it's first we've got to acknowledge the inequality that there's going to be some people that are still digitally excluded. And for that group, there is a lot of work that the sector needs to do to be able to bring them online, particularly in these circumstances where there's going to be increased social isolation. But in terms of that article, it came from a place of frustration. As a disabled person who campaigns, I use online tools all the time to be able to connect with people, whether it was using the change.org petition or using WhatsApp for organising, or Slack channels, or various other forms, even the basic email. And what was really striking was the lack of trust and legitimacy that was placed in online spaces, particularly by the sector in social change. It was very much seen as an add-on, or as this kind of armchair activism, lazy activism, rather than a proper engaging space. And I think one of the things that's coming out of this is that we're having to now take online spaces seriously and give them the legitimacy that they've always had. In the short term, that means we've suddenly got this massive boom in people picking up different tools, things like Zoom. I think that most organizations have suddenly picked these up, or having to set up Slack channels, etc. And that poses some solutions for what's happening right now in an organization or team level, but it also poses some challenges, that not all of these tools are accessible, that there's been a lot of questions raised about things like Zoom's data policy that could make vulnerable groups even more vulnerable. And that also there's not a lot of conversation about how do we use digital spaces well, and how do we safely use digital spaces. So we've got organizations such as Glitch campaigning against online harassment, which we know particularly affects women of color. So we need to think about the fact that whether it's our internal online spaces within our teams and organizations, or our external facing ones, such as this kind of thing, or being on Twitter, or on other forms of social media, that there are new dynamics to now contend with, and that we need to think about the nature of inequality in those spaces, and that we don't entrench it further.
So it's kind of making sure we don't assume that just because we're suddenly online, we're doing equality really well, that recognizing how that plays out in a digital space. Is that what you're saying?
Definitely. I think there's recognizing this, where, as Wanda said, there's still power in play, and power is changing at the moment in how we understand it. But the groups that have already been excluded, so for disabled people, a lot of people are actually, there's been a lot of noise on disabled Twitter over the weekend and over the past week about the fact that now everyone's moved online. And these are the accommodations that people have been asking for years, to work from home, to be trusted to get on with their jobs. Suddenly, because we're in this point of crisis, we're able to do this. But that doesn't mean that we're doing it well. And it doesn't mean that we're doing it safely. So one of the things that we could think about at the moment is everyone's a bit anxious. And our behaviours when we're anxious, we all can go to various extremes of our own behaviours. So be more controlling, more, we could be slightly ruder in our communication styles. We could be not so clear about what we need. We might actually completely withdraw and be really avoidant. So it's about, how do we have good online communication? How do we make sure that our communication styles don't get into a place where there's bullying and harassment happening? But also, where there was already issues in workplaces, where there's already structural racism, or there's overtly racist, sexist, ableist comments happening, just because we have now moved into our own homes doesn't mean that we are now safe from those comments and those spaces. In fact, it means that those comments and those spaces are coming into our homes, and we need to think about, how do we act as bystanders if we see this happening in digital spaces? And Glitch has some really good resources on that, which I'd recommend to people. And also, how do we think about switching off and stepping away from digital spaces when it gets too much? How can leaders create safe spaces?
We've got a question popping up, but we might come back to that question in a minute, because there's a couple more questions that I want to pull out from what you've said. I think something I'd not really considered about the from what you're saying about boundaries for people, so that in terms of coming into people's homes, this communication work is coming into people's home. How can we work from home well? What does a well home workspace mentally and physically look like?
So I think the first thing is that working from home, you're still connected to your organisation and your team. And the responsibility, if we're talking about leadership and how chief execs or managers can be working in this place, is how do we set boundaries and expectations? Right now, if we're talking about working in an inclusive way, which would be working well, people have now got new childcare responsibilities during the workday. They've got medication shortages, which they're trying to sort out, or trying to work out how to get food to their homes. I'm in the highest risk group, so I've 12 weeks indoors, which has been a logistical nightmare to sort out in terms of just making sure I've got the basics organised. So people are going to have to work a bit more flexibly. We're going to have to think about the fact that there might be touch points in the day that you want to have for working, but asking people to work 9 to 5 is not going to be realistic. We need to think about, how can we flex that? But equally, if we don't want emails to be sent all evening, how do you use tools that allow you to schedule emails so that they go out at 9 o'clock in the morning, rather than say at 1 o'clock in the morning, because that was the bit of time that you found. But in the daytime, you've been with your child, or even right now taking some time out because your mental health has been stressed by this situation. It's a global pandemic. None of us are going to be responding normally. So actually recognizing that we need to find that flex. I think there's a lot to be learned from disabled people in this space. This is not a normal work from home situation. Working from home is a skill set, in the same way that working in an office is a skill set. And we often don't think about that because, we've been working in these environments for a while. And we need to get our heads around that we're working differently, that we might not be as productive as we are hoping to be. We have unproductive days in the office. We're allowed unproductive days at home. We need to think about, how do we pace ourselves? This is a long haul. This isn't a short week or two, particularly for the groups that are going to be asked to stay in for long periods of time. This is going to be going on for a while. So if we're talking about this in a work situation, we need to think about, how do we think about the key things that need to be done in the day, communicate our priorities clearly between our team. If you've deprioritized someone's piece of work because it can't be delivered because of what's happening right now, be aware of what that might be doing for them, even though you might still be busy. Being aware that actually there are other people who have suddenly got to grieve losing pieces of work, and how we can support their mental health as much as the people who've suddenly got busier because they've got a lot on, they've got to turn things around and change strategy. But I think that this move online, it's highlighting systemic pressures, it's highlighting the inequality that already exists. But it's also, as Wanda said, it's giving us an opportunity for innovation. And right now, taking a few moments to reflect, whether it's daily, weekly, whatever you can find. I recognise that for different organisations, your flex is going to be different. But just to notice what changes are working and to check in as a team will make a huge difference. The big thing that happens when you're not face to face is you don't know what people's moods are. So you don't know how things are landing when they land in their inbox. Communication right now, not just about what needs to be done, but how people are, is going to be critical.
There's something that we've talked about at ACEVO is kind of over communicate. That you think that might be a normal amount of communication, but actually make sure you over communicate to try and keep those links alive. So it sounds like at least that's something that you would agree with. Yeah,
definitely. And be clear about your boundaries and expectations. That, you know, some people WhatsApp might be their private digital space. So then maybe you need to look at having a Slack channel. Be clear about what spaces you're using and how they're being used.
And what do you think leaders specifically should be thinking about now in terms of embedding any learning that's taking place about how practice is changing, so that when this is over, whenever that happens, that we don't just slide back into exactly how we were acting before? So
I think the first bit is recognizing power and vulnerabilities in this space. So this is a microcosm of what's been happening for an awful lot of marginalized communities. The sense of financial insecurity, social isolation, precarious work, being denied access to space, uncertain and arbitrary government decisions. This is what people at the harsh end of inequality have been experiencing for years. Having been on benefits myself, I can remember the dread of the brown letter from DWP. So part of this is, whilst I've got a real thing about why you shouldn't use disability simulation exercises, and Zara Todd does a great article about this. This is giving us an understanding of what it's been like for everyone who's been at that harsh edge of inequality, and just to make it clear that it's going to be compounded for them right now. So that's one thing, is the learning of how does it feel when you're constantly in this anxious state, when you constantly don't know and your head's a bit all over the place. The next bit would be, there are lots of online tools. Take some time to get to know them and embed good learning. If you have even the luxury of a couple of minutes, check in about how people are using them and what they like and what they don't like. Because that continuous learning, rather than kind of trying to let's do a roundup of this once, you know, we're all out of the quarantine period, is going to keep you moving and is going to keep things gently moving forward. So this more agile, flexible way of working. I think also just seeing online space as legitimate, and seeing that work from home is an option and that accommodations can happen and can work. Flexible working can work. These are things that people in the sector have been campaigning for years, and there's been a real resistance. People have really not wanted to go towards them. And I think what we can learn from this is it is possible. We're showing it's possible. And this is a way of us communicating with each other to make these connections and make it work better. However, we do need to recognise that there's some people that are now currently having to work from home who've got, you know, lower speed broadband because that's what they can afford, versus the higher speed that they'll, you know, their colleagues might have. So the chief exec might have a faster speed than the person who's the officer level. I mean, this helps to show some of the gaps again in digital infrastructure that prevent people from being able to work from home well or access these kind of accommodations.
That's all excellent, really practical advice. Thank you. Just to go to the question that somebody has put forward already, which is, so the language used about disabled and older people by the government and media and volunteer groups is dehumanising. How can we combat this as a sector?
Yes. So as my friends would recognise from over the weekend, I've been a bit ranty about this. It's been really difficult because if you are someone who's in the high risk group or you are an older person, there's been a sense that your life is expendable, and that it is that the main message is for everyone else, and that the messages for you are, try. At the moment, we've now moved to this shielding, but before the shielding in particular, there's been an awful lot of very mixed messages about what to do, and a sense that the people that will be treated first, in fact, what we know is happening in Italy, is the prioritization of treatment is going towards people that are more likely to survive, which is less likely to be people over 70 and people with long-term conditions who are in the highest risk group. And that's a really hard thing to sit with. I think there was a brilliant talk by one of the doctors on Channel 4 who talked about how they will still treat and what they will do, but why they won't, say, intubate for COVID. But I think there's something which is even more important here. These groups have already been isolated. I don't know about other people with chronic illnesses, but for me, I've already had 6 months of social distancing and social isolation due to it being winter and that being a peak period of flare-ups for me. And what is really striking about that is that it puts you in a position where you already, we've just seen the sunshine. We thought we were coming out and emerging for some of us. And actually, it's going to be a difficult time of year again. We're now looking at potentially up to a year of isolation on top of this. So key things, checking in on people. Let's actually start from like the small behaviors. Check in with your friends. Make sure that just check in regularly. People's moods are going to be up and down. The messages are hard. When it comes to actually a more general message from organisations, I think it's being really clear that you are speaking to the groups who are affected. That you're speaking rather than just the message of stay away from the over 70s or stay away from high risk groups. Talking directly to people who are in high risk groups and signposting them to materials that can help with mental health, with apps that can allow them to connect with people, and also just being really aware about talking about things like, for some people, asking for help is going to feel incredibly vulnerable. We know that disabled women are more likely to experience domestic violence, for instance. So the dependency element of this is going to be hard. And actually looking at how we can help people safely create relationships online. So there's a lot there. There's a lot to be done. But a big thing is, if your communications are only targeted at the younger people or at people outside of those groups, then needs to be a reconfiguring and think about that those groups are currently on the harsh end of those messages and probably on their own at home or in small groups at home, having to listen to those.
Yeah. And on the question of the word vulnerable, specifically,
yes.
Is that, I don't know, are words good? But I think that's the word that's most often used, especially in stuff I've seen. So what does that mean to you as a disabled person? Is that a word that you identify with, or is it? Yeah,
it definitely jars when you hear yourself being called vulnerable. But I think the best way to think about vulnerability is it's in relation to power. And power at the moment is about the choices that people make or don't make. My vulnerability is in relation to the choices that people will currently make about social distancing. It's about the choices that people will make, whether they put their organisations online so I can continue to work, or they decide not to. But I think the other bit is that vulnerability has always been there. It's exacerbated by the current situation. There's something horrible actually about having to hold vulnerability, because it is a tacit admission of the fact that people have power over you and that harm can be done to you. If you have the privilege and power in this situation to be doing something else, this is a great time to be using that allyship, to be looking at other ways of doing things. I think the other bit is, when it comes to vulnerability, there are a lot of people right now who have got a lot of skills around working from home, around dealing with high levels of anxiety, who come from vulnerable communities. And there's ways of tapping into that, and rather than taking that as content and putting it on your website or whatever, platforming those people and putting their ideas out, but making sure their names are attached to it. So typically marginalized groups who have worked really well online for over the years have led in this area of online community building, on online spaces. So this is an opportunity for those who have got power and privilege in this situation, who have got the means, to be able to give people bigger platforms. I think one of my favorite people in terms of disability space at the moment is Mia Mingus. Following her on Twitter and Instagram. I think she's sharing a lot of really good resources. She's US based, but they're really interesting in terms of how we look at transformative justice and disability justice approaches, but also wider approaches to just working well.
Thank you. And they've got another question in. As someone with an invisible chronic illness, I look fine on the outside and people don't understand how hard it is and why I have to stay away from everyone and everything. It's really hard and frustrating. Any thoughts about how you deal with similar feelings?
Yes, sure. So I think there's something about our concept of what disability is. This is going to be a really interesting challenge for other people, because for the first time we're starting to understand that disability doesn't look like just one thing. For a long time we have seen disability as symbolized by a wheelchair. Now there are plenty of wheelchair users in the UK and we shouldn't exclude these groups, but there are also a lot of people that like me, I mean, I use a walking stick to get about, I sometimes use other mobility aids, but day to day people are often comment, oh, you look fine, you look great. Just because you can see someone, just because they're out and about, doesn't mean, or currently staying very firmly indoors for 12 weeks, doesn't mean that they are well. And also, I think we need to think about the difference as well between when we talk about chronic illness and impairment. We shouldn't have to explain what our impairments are. We should be able to talk about disability. What are the barriers in the environment, in the institutions, and in attitudes that are preventing us from being able to get on with our day-to-day lives? And I think that if we can rejig our way of thinking to, rather than intrusive questions and what condition do you have, to be able to, you know, to allow people to have access to support, to people being able to say, I have a chronic condition, and being able to move forward from there, that would make a huge difference in how people can live day to day. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you and I've talked at different times about the idea of kind of disclosing that you're a disabled person. So there might be a lot of people in the workplace who are disabled but have not told their work about it. It's an invisible disability, and now might feel like they have to because they fall within some of the vulnerable categories or high risk categories. So what, as a, you know, if, as a CEO, if somebody's coming, you know, to them who's worked for them for say a couple of years and now is, I suppose, not questioning that disclosure or not seeking, you know, not asking lots of questions about it would be the important thing.
Yeah, I think be led by the person. Some people are really willing to share what their conditions are or to share symptoms. Other people are much more private about it. I think the key thing right now is that, isn't it a shame that people couldn't come forward before and say that they had these conditions, and why weren't people able to do that before? Because of fear of losing their jobs, of not being taken seriously in the workplace, of not being given the accommodations that they need. And what harm have people done to themselves in not disclosing over the years? So I think we need to really rethink how we have dealt with disability for a long time. But I think there's also other spaces here. We've got to think about the fact that it's not just disabled people that are facing suddenly high levels of challenge. Parents who have always faced a lot of challenges when it comes to working and have, you know, wanted flexible working are suddenly being faced with a situation where they've got higher needs but a higher offer of flexible working as well. I think what you were saying earlier about what does the long term look like and what can we embed, when we step away from this, let's not step away from the fact that actually right now we're in crisis mode and we are using everything to the last inch of its resource. Can we not put some of these measures in place earlier so that if we have things like this in the future, we have more flex in our system to be able to respond and have that contingency to be able to keep working?
Thank you. I had another question come in. So we need to guard against physical distancing becoming social distancing as we communicate more, but without the norms of physical cues, we have to take more care.
100% agree. So it is much, much harder, even now, not knowing how people are responding as you're talking and whether people are on board with something or you're getting the furrowed brow and they're kind of, what are you talking about? Look, there's going to be a lot of miscommunication. This is going to be a lot of practice in good communication over the coming months of checking in. There is also going to be points that I think we need to be clear about what are acceptable behaviours in this time, because just because things are difficult doesn't allow for behaviours to go to extremes.
Yeah.
So I think when you talk about bullying behaviours or, you know, extreme micromanagement, things that ACAS would call as bullying, we need to think about that. So in terms of harm reduction, we need to think about how do we prevent ourselves from getting to those extremes. In terms of the physical distancing versus social distancing, we need to think about different types of apps that we can be using, different types of ways that we can be communicating with each other, and also checking in how people like to be communicated with. I'm a massive introvert. I absolutely love WhatsApp and being able to text. I do normally run away from a phone call if someone makes it to me without telling me. At the moment, I'm picking them up. So I'm recognizing that other people will want to have those video chats or phone calls out of the blue. And I think it's learning that we might have to have a little bit of flex with what we're doing. The other bit is actually telling people if you're sat on the phone and you can't physically see someone because that's the infrastructure that you've got available to you, and you can feel yourself tensing up, you can say, I'm actually tensing up here. Explain what is going on with the body, is as much as you feel comfortable with. Explain when you're comfortable or not comfortable. And that can really help give you some clear, the more that we take on communicating our own needs, the easier it is. But I would say in organisations, this has to come from the top. Permission is given by people at the top, one, communicating their needs and communicating even their anxieties or what's going on, but being very clear that they're holding it and allowing space for other people to bring their stuff forward and for them to be able to hold it. Sounds a bit like therapy chat, but it's quite useful at the moment. And I would say that actually there's a lot of therapists on Instagram who are sharing some really useful resources right now. And same with a lot of communication organisations. Have a look at that and see if you can find things that can work for you, or little facilitation tips that can help you. Or you could even do what my sister's workplace did the other day, which is they got everyone to dress up for their team meeting as a letter B, which resulted in her dressing up as Belle from Beauty and the Beast. So there are silly
Keeping
things
it
that you
fun.
can do to keeping it fun, keeping it light. It's going to be heavy for the next few weeks. Let's look at where joy can be brought in.
Yeah, I think I find it really hard when everyone mutes their microphone on Zoom and you don't know if people are like nodding with you, like your non-verbal cues, and you're like, oh, I like it. It feels quite alone otherwise.
Yes.
I think just as a last question for you, I'm just going to quote yourself at you again. So you wrote an article earlier this year for 10 Years Times report on climate change activism, and you talked about how disabled people had been excluded from that movement in many ways. And you said urgent action is required on climate change. However, urgency must not justify discrimination. Do you think there's a risk here as we move with such pace to respond to COVID-19 that could happen? And what kind of leaving wisdom would you have for people for that?
So I think that Vicky's quote at the beginning about how people responded, that, you know, having a tweet that someone responded that, you know, we need to just get on with this and worry about inclusion later. Inclusion shouldn't be an add-on. Inclusion is part of our mission as a sector. And this is not just about disability, this is going to be about a range of groups. So I think going back to the points that Wanda made about, like, let's listen to our beneficiaries. There's going to be a lot of changes right now, and how, so if you're in a service-based organisation or a campaigning one, listen to what's needed. I think keep an eye on the legislation, the Care Act today, and the work that Inclusion London's doing around campaigning around that is really, really important, so that we can make sure that we aren't missing out and actually creating things. So the Care Act, they're removing support for vulnerable people at the point that we're trying to shield vulnerable people. We could end up with more people in the healthcare system because of the changes to the Care Act, rather than the support from the Care Act being removed, opening up support for more people. It doesn't work. It is not sensible, and it shows actually a lack of understanding about disability and care needs for the elderly in the UK. So that's another thing. So look at your legislation, then let's look at your teams. This is not right now is a time that behaviours are going to be a little bit out of balance. Be clear on your boundaries, your expectations. Be really clear about what are acceptable and unacceptable behaviours. And discrimination is never an acceptable behaviour. And get ready for the fact that we're going to need to communicate more. So yeah, I would say that keep looking at those different levels. At the moment, we need to get our teams and organisations sorted short term, but we also do need to be keeping an eye on the legislation and also on how we're talking to people out there. So yeah, sorry, another final point, talking about the groups that have felt dehumanised. Let's start talking in inclusive ways. Let's think about our communications and ask the question, who will be missing? Who's not in the room? Who's not being included? And who is going to be at the harshest end of all of the measures that are currently happening right now?
That is brilliant. Thank you very much, Becca. You've given lots of really interesting thoughts, practical tips, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people going back to listen again when we post this online. So, because we're recording these and we're posting them up later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So with me again, our next speaker is Mubin Haq, who's the CEO of Standard Life Foundation. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. So just to say a bit about you. So you joined the Standard Life Foundation in 2018, and you've worked for a number of independent funders, including Trust for London and the South East London Community Foundation. You were at Trust for London for over 10 years, where you were the Director of Policy and Grants, and developed a range of initiatives tackling poverty and inequality, including strategic work on the living wage. You've been on the boards of a range of organisations, including as Chair of London Funders, and on the boards of the Community Foundation Network and the London Strategic Migration Partnership and the Homelessness Transition Fund. It's another really impressive biography. Thank you so much for joining us, Ruben. So the first question, so in the last couple of weeks, it seems that the majority of trusts and foundations have been really quick to offer support and flexibility to the charities they fund. A letter coordinated by Trust for London's already had over 200 grant makers sign up. And I had a look on your website over the weekend, and there was an incredibly supportive message on your organisation's website for your grantees. So I wanted to thank you on behalf of charities who I know that's been so welcome on, but also just to ask, how do you think COVID-19 will impact trusts and foundations specifically in the short and long term?
So just to say, the statement was coordinated by London Funders rather than Trust for London.
Oh gosh,
sure they would love that.
Giving them excellent credit, aren't I? Everyone needs a mistake. Thank you.
It's fine. I mean, I think that, just to say on that statement bit, that was really done very quickly and was a really good starter for trusts and foundations. So well done to London Funders for that, and all the funders who've signed up to it as well. And it's worth saying, I've not seen that kind of coordination happen from charitable funders or funders generally in all of my time working in the sector. It's been very impressive in that sense. But there's a few things we need to be thinking about, really. There's three things really. One is in relation to our grants programs, one is in relation to our operations, as is the case with lots of other organisations. The other is in relation to our investments. The biggest part relates to our grants programs, and that's where that funder statement was really useful. In particular, it talked about the sort of flexibility funders now need to adopt. And really need to think about that in terms of what flexibility means. But obviously, different funders are on different journeys in terms of what they can do and what their style of grant making was before. So for those who were generally giving significant types of core grant, they can move much more easily to that unrestricted basis. But that's something that all of us as funders need to be considering. But, you know, what does that mean in terms of the budgets and moving the spend around in relation to that? What does it mean in relation to timelines? What does it mean in relation to reporting requirements? There's a lot that funders can actually do, and I think key to this is a dialogue that needs to happen within groups and their funders, and working on a time scale that really fits for those organisations. So not being too needy, not creating onerous requirements on groups, realising that they are going through a hugely difficult time. Obviously, funders are going through a period of change, but it's nothing like what's happening on the front line. One of the most amazing things about being a funder is that you actually have an endowment usually. So this creates a huge buffer for you in order to take a more long-term approach. And so the sorts of things that groups on the ground are worrying about, we are not worrying about in the same kind of way. We have different challenges. And also just a shout out to the Arts Council England in terms of how it responded in relation to its grants and saying, you know, you can use this money to pay freelancers and individual artists rather than the particular programs that you may have had. Also, funders are now thinking about new funds that they may create. So we've seen quite a lot of activity from community foundations. We've also seen the National Emergencies Trust start to pull money together and to collect that. Wellcome Foundation launched a 50 million fund specifically looking at research into this issue. Nuffield Foundation I saw was doing some really interesting work to kind of examine what the implications of coronavirus are going to be, the long-term implications about gathering data on the ground. And there's lots of others. I mean, Scottish Government has created this £20 million resilience fund for the third sector. So it's starting to happen. I've had quite a few conversations with other funders, and I know lots of that's happening by the umbrella bodies such as the Association of Charitable Foundations and London Funders and other sort of networks that there are to think about how funders can respond. And we're thinking about that too at Standard Life Foundation, and we will be announcing something quite shortly in terms of our particular fund programs. The other thing that funders can do is in relation to advocacy. So using where we can, often we can't sit on the sidelines and we fund other organisations and they have a voice, and that's absolutely right that that's the case. But actually we also have quite a lot of intelligence in terms of information we're gathering, and we can advocate ourselves as well, probably more so than at any time before. Some funders are more happier with this kind of approach, like Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others. So we can use our communications channels in relation to that. This is not about being an armchair epidemiologist or anything like that. But what does it mean actually for groups on the ground, for the sort of communities that we're supporting? We deal with people on low to middle incomes. This is absolutely central to their lives, their livelihoods, and the impact it's going to have on them. And then just lastly, two other things. Operations, as with everyone else, we're having to figure out how we work from home, as well as the sort of grant payments that need to be made. And thankfully, I think most funders have sorted that out. And then on the investment side, that's probably the bigger one, because most funders are invested in some way within the stock markets, and those are plummeted, and we really can't see how far it's going to go, to be honest. So I think that's going to have an immediate cut in terms of funders' programs now, but we how long this is going to go on for and what the impacts may be in future years. So for those funders who've got a permanent endowment where they need to maintain the value, that's going to be difficult. For those like us who've got an expendable endowment, I think, you know, we need to think that this really is an unprecedented moment, and how we use those funds now. But there also needs to be a conversation probably with the Charity Commission in relation to some of these permanent endowments and the flexibility that can be allowed in relation to that. So that's just a sort of broad overview of where we're at, I think.
That's a lot of key issues to pick up. Thank you. And I think you mentioned the way the trust and foundation sector has come together is kind of unique. It hasn't been done as quickly, and I think similar in the infrastructure and membership bodies. I think with trusts and foundations, do you think that's been a long time coming, that there's been changes in how trusts and foundations have been operating and more kind of being more comfortable with the advocacy role, or do you think it's the extraordinary nature of the event itself that's pulled people together in this time?
It's the extraordinary nature of it. I mean, we've never known anything like this, to be honest. And also we have to realise that we have our limitations as well. And that's why what's so important is this work which is being done by government. So government has the resources to be able to do things at a level that none of us can. So they're now from the Chancellor on Friday in relation to 80% of incomes up to a cap of £2,500 being available for employees who need to be furloughed was unbelievable. I never expected anything like that. The role of our sector is about how we advocate for what those needs are. So we have this challenge in relation to the self-employed and the support that's required there. So we've got this top element, which is from government, but then there's the bottom element, which is how do we keep communities together and that people aren't isolated. And so we've seen this flourishing really of these mutual aid groups across the country. So what's needed is both of those elements, not just the top down or the bottom up. And we need to acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses each side have in relation to dealing with this unprecedented issue that we have with coronavirus.
And I think when we talk about kind of developing potentially new grant streams or new funding programs in response to COVID-19, and there's been a lot of talk when we're developing programs about involving communities and making sure that they have input. And a lot of that is often done face to face, if I'm right. So do you think there'll be a challenge in doing that digitally, and how have you thought about how that might be overcome?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, usually we think about these over quite a long time. We have lots of engagement. We make sure people are involved. Trust for London's done a really interesting programme recently in terms of disabled people and having a programme specifically for that group, which engages those communities. Well, that's going to be hugely challenging to do now. So yes, we've got to absolutely move with speed and try and be as engaging as possible. A lot of this we don't need to reinvent. We actually know that there's some groups who are going to be particularly affected. So we don't need to go on a sort of evidence gathering exercise in relation to that. We know that coronavirus hits some people more than others, and others cannot do the working from home. They can't do the self-isolation. That particularly affects some sectors, but in essence, this is going to hit people on the lowest incomes the hardest. It's going to hit those in precarious work the hardest, the self-employed, disabled people, those who are vulnerable, even things that we've not necessarily thought about overall, like people who are affected by domestic violence and what self-isolation is going to mean there, single parents, etc. So and across these issues are going to be cross-cutting themes in terms of ethnicity and migration status in particular as gender. And so we must adapt our programs to reflect that and use the technology that we have to make sure that we engage with organisations on the ground, particularly our grantees, but where we've got gaps in relation to some of those groups, that we have that sort of engagement that's required.
Yeah, that links in well to a question that's come in. Are there particular parts of our sector who need extra support, for example, user-led organisations and groups?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's started actually before this, before the pandemic, where a number of funders were talking about lived experience in particular, and the fact that we cannot have this continuing situation where it's just organisations speaking on behalf of their beneficiary groups, but actually what we need is that sort of real knowledge, the experiences from the ground, that people are not just case studies, that they actually have got solutions as well. So although we've not been going, well, New Foundation, we've not been going for very long, we've made 13 grants so far, but 2 of them have at their core element of lived experience to them. And so we need to be doing more of that. And I think, as Vanda said earlier, we need to have tying up groups who are more at the sort of policy end, not necessarily are representative of these communities, greater collaboration and partnership between those sorts of groups. And we're going to have to do that at a much faster speed than we've had to think about before. This isn't a sort of nice to have, it's a necessity.
Thank you. Another question. How would the National Emergencies Trust and the Red Cross ensure that funding and voluntary responses from large-scale appeals are also equitable and inclusive? So maybe hard for you to answer exactly, but some reflections on that as a theme.
Yeah, so I think it's tying into what I've said already. Anybody needs to think about how these funds are going to get out to those most in need. And some of these groups who are particularly dealing with single issues like disability or migrant organisations are going to be very, very well placed to get through to them. But this is not to say that mainstream groups can't do this too, and that they are let off a hook, and that somehow this is something that, oh, you're a refugee, go to the refugee organisation to deal with. Mainstream organisations have improved over the years from my experience. That is hit and miss in different parts of the country, but funders also need to be saying to them, what are you doing? How are you getting these communities as well? So there's I mean, I'm sure that the National Emergencies Trust, the British Red Cross, will be thinking about this. They've had lots of experience from other types of emergencies that have happened, but this is like nothing we've seen before, to be honest.
Yeah. And in terms of
also just to say on that, I think there's a real role for advocacy organisations to hold us to account and to say, okay, so this is what's happening in our situation, and feeding back that intelligence.
And then as a kind of leaders watching this, and leaders of trusts and foundations, what kind of leadership do you think we need? What kind of leadership do you think we should be seeing from trusts and foundations at the moment to help get us through this crisis and beyond?
Well, I think we've got to be humble as well. Although I was talking about advocacy and all the rest of it, that's got to be done in partnership with organisations that were funding. I think we've got to be thinking not just about the immediate, but also the medium and the longer term. What kind of society do we want to see at the end? We don't want to be going back to normal. As other people have said, Becky in particular, you know, the sort of situation that people are facing now is a situation that a number of vulnerable groups have been facing for a very long time. A lot of us who have some privilege and have resources are now waking up to that. And so we definitely need to be listening a lot more. We need our sort of learning, our intelligence, talking to each other, being supportive of each other. And also, let's just ditch any branding that there is in relation to this. Let's not worry about that. That's the least of our concerns. I think that's been a huge problem in the past towards partnership working and groups collaborating. We need to not be afraid of other organisations stealing our ideas anymore. The more that people actually use our ideas, the more that we will actually save lives in relation to this.
Thank you. So I saw a letter that was circulated on Twitter a couple of days ago by a group called Future Foundations, which supports minoritised racial groups working in the UK trust and foundation sector to connect and create a vision for a just future. One of the topics of the letter was how can independent funders and foundations ensure their response is as far-reaching as the circumstances created by COVID-19. Is that something you have any reflections on in terms of making sure the response is far-reaching? Because trusts and foundations still have limits that they have to work within, kind of charitable objects. So what thoughts would you have on that?
Yeah, so look, a lot of foundations also have quite wide remits as well. So they may decide they want to focus on a particular aspect of work. So we may have, a lot of us will have objectives relating to relieving and addressing poverty. We'll have objectives relating to education. So we've got the scope already there if we wanted to widen what we do. And if we don't, then we can also go to our regulators. In our case, it's OSCO in Scotland, and in England, the Wales Charity Commission. But go to them and say, look, these are really unprecedented times. It would be surprising if funders couldn't think through ways in which they can address these particular issues. And we don't need to all be doing the same thing. It would be wrong for us all to be doing the same thing. There'll be particular bits of expertise that we have, or areas where we have gained a lot of intelligence over the years from the organisations we're working with. So, for example, at Trust for London, speaking to colleagues there, we're doing a lot of work around employment rights, because it's an area they've been working on for many years. And so that's something that they can do practically. There's other foundations which are particularly focused on housing. Don't necessarily broaden from that, but what are the specific housing needs on that? We have something specific which is about financial well-being. You can't get any more central in relation to that here. So, we know, for example, that people have already been haven't had anything to fall back on in terms of a rainy day. 4 in 10 have savings of less than £500, and that's even more so for people on low to middle incomes. Over half have no savings whatsoever. So this isn't a rainy day, this is a monsoon we've got, and people just don't have it. And that's why the state is absolutely fundamental to being able to pick up the billions that will be needed. But at the same time, we would need to make sure that democracy flourishes, that we also hold government to account in terms of the extra powers that are giving themselves. So, this is, we each have a role to play in here. They are at different types of level, but we each can do something. And that's hugely important. It's understanding what we can do. So not just jumping into this in some sort of random kind of way, but thinking quite carefully and talking. Leaders really need to talk to their teams as well about the idea that they have too. I'm sure they're doing.
And then, so last question from me. I think it sounds like there'll be almost a lot of pressure on trusts and foundations and staff to have answers and to fund and provide support. What do you think is important to look after the mental health of people working in those teams at the moment, so they don't feel like they're being asked to make decisions that are, they are making decisions which impact people's lives. So how can they be supported in that?
Yes, I think as with any good teams, it's kind of like having somebody that you can talk to as well. So that's what we do as managers, and kind of talking through those decisions. It's also allowing people to have huge amounts of flexibility as well, so that they feel that they've got control in relation to things, but to check in where they feel they're not sure about something. And I think, as we were as some of our previous speakers were talking about before, we also need to accept that some of our staff now have children at home, or have other caring responsibilities, or may become ill themselves, and how do we allow them the flexibility to do their work? So, you know, I've been having conversations with colleagues and like what that means, and you know, we don't want people to have to juggle so much, and you know, their mental health is absolutely key to that. So there'll be lots of stuff online. I'm not an expert necessarily in this. That's the stuff where, you know, listening to Becky, I was thinking, oh, there's some really good ideas there. And so, you know, we need to just accept that we'll learn from others, and the staff will have ideas too. So it's not all coming from us, it's about the ideas that they have too.
Yeah, absolutely. Listening and still being a leader that learns and seeks answers and grows. So that sounds great. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we finish today?
No, I mean, I think just to say to the other funders out there as well, that what we've seen over the past few weeks is the power of advocacy. And I know lots of funders have not necessarily thought that's the most important thing, or struggled with campaigning and advocacy. It's something I've talked about for many years, and, you know, thought it's been hugely important. We have seen how the government has responded to that. Everyone's who's in that field has contributed hugely to that. I think, you know, hearing the Chancellor talk about the TUC, you know, a Conservative Chancellor saying that, and the quite important role that they have, that's really encouraging. You know, other think tanks, other organisations have been really doing quite a lot on that. So this is why it's needed, because government has been, to a certain extent, pushed into this from that advocacy. And the same will be happening in relation to the self-employed and other areas where we need to see greater resource coming from government. So let's not lose this. Let's carry on supporting that advocacy, and when we come out of this, that it's an important area of work that needs funding.
Great, thank you. That's a great note to end on. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to hand back over to Vicky now.
Thank you. Thanks, Mimi. Thanks, Christiana. So for our final segment today, we're going to be looking at how the sector can ensure that we look at our responses to COVID-19 through a racial justice lens. And I'm delighted to be joined by Camille St. Omar Donaldson today. She's an organiser. Hi, Camille. Organiser with Charity So White, and a committee member there. And Charity So White is the campaign to raise awareness of institutional racism in the social sector. It creates a platform for those who are affected by these issues to speak up about them. But when she's not doing that, she is a supporter experience project lead at the British Red Cross, and she co-chairs the charity's BME network there. She's also a trustee and programme chair of Beyond Suffrage, which is a new programme helping to elevate young women of colour onto leadership and boards, and enabling them to become our future change makers. So, Camille, thank you for joining us today. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say about Charity So White. Have I explained enough about what you're trying to do?
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Right.
I'm not sure. Yeah, we can talk about that first.
Great.
But...
So we're talking here about racial justice. It's not a term that perhaps people are as familiar with as they would be things like diversity and equality. So I wonder if you just set the scene for us a little bit about what racial justice is.
Definitely. I think for us at Charity So White, racial justice is really about the kind of systematic, fair treatment of people of all races. It's something I think that therefore if achieved, it means that kind of it results in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. And I think why it's important for us to discuss and talk about racial justice is because it means that we'll be instead talking about the impact of institutional racism, which a lot of the speakers actually already this morning have started to kind of lean towards. When it comes, I think, for us to the change that we want to see in the sector and the conversations that we at Charity So White have about race, we definitely do it in the space of talking about power and privilege and lived experience, rather than talking about things like diversity and inclusion. And I think for us, with framing in some situations the discussion solely around diversity and inclusion, is that it can quite quickly become a conversation that centers around things like numbers or data, which already exists, or can quite often become quite an excuse for why things aren't happening. Maybe we need to do more research, or there needs to be more resources. And again, those things exist. So I think people sometimes can sort of default to talking about the interpersonal rather than actually looking at the structures and the processes that we see for ethnic minorities across kind of health, education, housing, the criminal justice system. And yeah, that's what kind of has the biggest impact on racial injustice, really.
And I touched a little bit on this with Vanda on kind of broader inequalities, but in terms of this current crisis, the threats for racial justice work, what do you think the specific challenges are that we're now facing?
Yeah, I think kind of first kind of conversation that you were having with Vanda definitely hit the nail on the head, and I'll definitely take the opportunity to kind of expand on some of those things that you've already discussed. But I think one of the things that we've been talking about, firstly, with Charity So White, is that absolutely we're extremely compassionate with the situation that I think leaders are in at the moment. And we want to make sure that we've kind of got that space to give information and advice to kind of help with the difficult decisions I think that we're going to have to make as a sector. But in real threats that are faced to us. And I think firstly looking at them in two ways. So kind of looking at the internal threats, so kind of internally as how we operate as a sector, and then kind of looking more broadly at the bigger picture on how those kind of external threats will be impacting us as a sector, and therefore what we go on to do and what type of gaps that we'll have to plug. So I think starting first of all with the threats that we face in the sector, one of the really real fears for us is that racial justice work then becomes deprioritized. I think particularly given some of the attention that it's been given. I mean, even today, the conversation was supposed to be about kind of launching that report, and I absolutely agree that today's not the right kind of time to be able to do that. But kind of thinking about how can we, or should we, be alongside our responses to the crisis, still be thinking about this racial justice work. I think I truly believe that it's at the heart of having a successful response. It's a never-changing situation for us, but I think we've really got a space within the civil society to really think about kind of having a voice for those people who publicly are at the moment. It's kind of what we live to do. So I think I mentioned, yeah, there's been kind of some real progress already with the racial kind of injustice and conversations around that, and really kind of acknowledging racism within the sector. And I think the fear is that, yeah, it then becomes ignored whilst the priority is to respond. And I think it needs to be as much of the conversation now more than ever, for the reasons that kind of we've mentioned, but also kind of Vanda spoke about and Becca spoke about earlier on as well. So that actually we don't go back and kind of revert back to those kind of old structures, but also ending up with a even whiter kind of sector than we had before for us. I also think that there's a fear that, you know, when we're looking at how we're coming up with kind of policies and processes at the moment, and the ways of working, I think, is becoming quite different very quickly. And it's crucial that those aren't at the kind of expense of sidelining then people of colour along the way, and kind of still bringing that lived experience to the forefront, and not just accepting things that aren't acceptable just in the name of moving quickly. So again, I know that that's something that we will need to do, But again, the success will come from really making sure that racial justice is at the heart of that as well. I think I saw on Twitter that Ubele, they have just launched last week, a bit of a survey where they're collecting research from kind of BAME organizations and BAME employers, currently employees. And it's kind of vital that that kind of research is being conducted to really start to understand what the impact will be in the term, and the communities that we serve as well.
I think, sorry, carry on.
No, I was just going to say that was kind of looking at the internal threats, I think, kind of that we face as a sector. And I think
before you go to external, can I just pick up one point there on the on the power of privilege point? I think, and I think you sort of touched on that. There is a sense that you know, people, we've got to crack on with this. We can't hang about. We can't. Talking to too many people is just going to distract from just moving forward. What would your message be to leaders who potentially think that the power that they have is important, that now's the time to use that power to drive some of this stuff through? What would your message be about just that sense of, you know, potentially not holding back, but actually just thinking more widely about who is included in conversations?
Yeah, I think I'd probably go back to some of the things that hopefully we've learned from the response to Grenfell, for instance, and what happened in those situations where power wasn't given up to local communities and to kind of important voices within that community space. And I think it was really detrimental for the charity sector what the outcome was. And I'd hope that we've learned from that and the importance of being able to kind of touch base with those local grassroots and the role that they have to play. And definitely something to touch upon is kind of that trust then that is built together with those local kind of grassroots organizations. And it was damaged during Grenfell, I'd argue. And I think this is a real opportunity for us as a sector to be able to show that we can rebuild those relationships. Both the kind of important in our immediate response, but also for the long term as well, what happens kind of after this time. So I think, yeah, that's the only way that that's going to be achieved is by giving up that power and understanding that kind of and I think it is about thinking about the wider response, like who is best placed to be responding kind of on the ground in these situations or to have that access to funding in this time.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope that those messages have been learned, and certainly I'm seeing. I think if this crisis had happened before Grenfell, I think it would have been a very different set of responses. I do think Grenfell is and the experience there is influencing the way infrastructure bodies and others are thinking about this. But I think it's absolutely crucial that we emphasise this need to keep it front of mind. So you're about to go into kind of thinking about external threats, because we've covered the internal. What would you say is the external threats to the racial justice work?
I think, again, it's just picking up on Vanda's points that he made, but really thinking about the fact that ethnic minorities are overrepresented in the vulnerable groups that are going to be impacted by this crisis, and really trying to break that down and looking at the different ways that might manifest. So even looking at things like kind of, ethnic minorities with long-term health conditions. So we know, for example, that South Asians have a higher prevalence of diabetes. And when hospitals are absolutely stretched and doing their absolute most and being quite overwhelmed with the cases of coronavirus at the moment, I think we'll really start to see even further the impacts kind of healthcare not being able to deliver that kind of culturally prior to this pandemic or this crisis. I think the impact on low-income families also, and those without that kind of recourse to public funds. I think, again, having that BAME overrepresentation in those groups, more likely to be in that precarious work, more likely to have kind of higher rates of self-employment. And again, the gaps that will start to create. And yes, it seems like it's something that may, in some situations, may be out of control in terms of the sector's role. But actually, again, that long term is that those are the gaps that we're going to need to plug look into some of that action now, and make a commitment to making those changes. I think something that's really hit home for me personally, as well as my community, has been lots of the announcements that's been made by government, obviously recently. So, you know, the announcements around GCSEs and A levels, for example, being replaced by teacher assessments. Now, we know that often that can be steeped in a lot of bias. And I think it, especially if my brother was due to take his GCSEs, for example, he's a young Black Caribbean boy, and the impact that that's not only going to have on his kind of short-term opportunities, but also kind of that long-term. Also thinking about, again, kind of everyone needing to self-isolate. How does that work for people who live in crowded homes? And again, kind of ethnic minorities being a larger proportion of those groups. And I think just before I came on, that the COVID-19 bill, I think the really very real long-term impacts it will have for people of colour is something that I'm personally very fearful about. And again, you know, they're just a few examples, but I think that we haven't even kind of got to the surface of really understanding that kind of how far-reaching that impact is going to have. But this is where the sector can really kind of come to fruition in terms of making sure that these are things we're considering making action now, so that we don't have the kind of impact or can avoid some of the impact in the long term.
And so in terms of kind of advocacy and campaigning on these issues, what are you hoping to see?
Yeah, I think there's some really big opportunities for us in the sector at this time. This seems to be something that is really uniting us and forcing us potentially to work in different ways, and from a premise of trust, which I think has been quite rare in some issues, which is, you know, something to really hold on to. And I think it's how do we make sure that those changes that we're seeing, those working practices, things like with, you know, funders working more collaboratively, putting kind of people's needs first, how do we make sure that that's sustained? You know, London funders are doing great work in terms of kind of the statement that they brought out and kind of pooling together those funds. But again, how do we ensure that kind of BAME led organizations are not being left out, as we've seen in the past, where we've repeated those mistakes, you know, they're missing out on that funding. What kind of things can we put in place to make sure at the moment? So I think there's a really big opportunity with people kind of listening at the moment, thinking about new ways to doing things. As Becca and Vanda said, you know, kind of being innovative in kind of how we move forward. I think one of the things that we've been talking about as well with kind of Charity So White amongst the committee is, rather than kind of having some really clear direct asks at this moment, we're putting together a kind of larger paper that will have kind of recommendations on our thoughts in the next coming weeks. But I think at this time, it's really thinking about how we can encourage organizations to work towards principles that they can uphold, and some questions that they could and should be asking themselves at the moment to ensure that kind of voices aren't lost. So it'd be key to think about whether or not, especially within the funding space, things like ring fencing fundraising potentially for BAME-led organizations is something people want to consider. How we look at kind of maybe changing the criteria of kind of what's needed in terms of applying for funding to make that more accessible for those BAME-led groups. Outreach, as well, reaching out to those communities to let them know that that funding is available. And again, going back to that, identifying those community leaders and really giving up that power in a way that they have been to existing grantees for so long. So yeah, there's a real opportunity for us to kind of advocate and campaign in that space. And I think going back to the coronavirus bill or COVID-19 bill, I think as a sector, we've been amazing at putting pressure on the government and coming together to really advocate funding to be able to support the communities that we serve. And I think something I'd quite like to see is that kind of same pressure potentially being put on governments to think about kind of the impact that this bill is going to have, and seeing the sector kind of mobilize in the same way, and thinking about the impact that that's going to have on people of colour as well.
And I mean, it's pretty soon to be thinking about when all this is over. But when all this is over, what would your hopes be for how the sector will have changed, will be different to you know, if this is a kind of refining fire that's going to take us through? How what would you like to see us looking like after all of this?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is making sure that we don't kind of go at the risk of kind of ending up with a situation where BAME-led organisations, unfortunately, no longer exist. I think that's the case for all of the work that we're doing across the sector, but I think there's a particular fear for this kind of more grassroots local organisations, especially if they don't have that access to funding. I think it would be a sector that definitely has changed its way of working and has sustained, I think, the ways that we've been working recently. I think there's been a lot of positive in terms of things that are happening around funding, but also in terms of how we're making decisions. Suddenly all the things that we couldn't do before suddenly are all possible for us in the sector, and that's exciting. But I think there's a space to really think about how can we ensure that those blockers that were in there kind of previously that were preventing us from doing that, suddenly, once this is all over, like you said, it's kind of hard to think about. But I think, yeah, just kind of being able to sustain and take forward some of the things that we're seeing at the moment, which are really good coming out of the sector, is what I'd like to see. And ensuring, yeah, that we don't go back and end up with a kind of even whiter sector than we had before.
Yeah, absolutely. And a great comment we've just had from one of the people watching. We cannot put EDI on the back burner. This has happened with every other crisis, and it just stores up problems for later. Yeah. If we all remember to wear our EDI glasses for everything, we might make the step change we need to be an equitable sector. So I think that's really good. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up? Oh, hang on, I think we might have is that another question, Christiane? Let me just see, sorry.
I just wanted to jump on the back of that comment, actually.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, absolutely, I stand by that. And I think what's also important is that kind of intersectional approach as well. So whilst we're looking EDI lens, obviously we've been talking more about racial justice specifically, but that kind of intersection, you know, when we're talking about things like vulnerable groups, often the kind of message and rhetoric has been around older people within our communities. And I think as Becca was saying, people who are disabled have been missed from some of those conversations. But I think also thinking about that intersection of someone potentially who is disabled from a BAME group, is a woman, is self-employed, you know, what does that look like for them? And making sure that we're making those decisions through that lens as well will be quite vital.
Yeah, thank you. Great, I think that's it on questions as well. So unless there's anything else, Camille, that you wanted to contribute, I think we're done with that one. Thank you very much. Oh, hang on, don't go. Like a last minute intervention. Here we go. Are there any examples? Do you have any examples of the way in which criteria can be changed to make funds more accessible for BME minorities community-led organisations? So funders will be drawing up criteria right now for distributing emergency funds. So what would you want to see in terms of how? I think you talked about making it more accessible for BAME-led organisations to access funding. What sort of things do you want to see grant funders saying or doing to make that possible?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that we really want to consider to think about at Charity So White. And as I mentioned, we'll be definitely coming up with recommendations. So do follow us on Twitter, where we'll be giving platforms to people who are also in that space. But one of the very kind of things that we've discussed at the moment is potentially seeing that ring fencing is a way to make it more accessible for BAME-led organisations and organisations, is really thinking about, ensuring that kind of, you're kind of putting your money where your mouth is, in that sense of like saying, actually, we're going to ring fence a whole kind of chunk of this money to make sure it just goes to these particular groups, would really be showing that you're putting kind of that at the forefront and you're looking at it through that racial justice lens as well. In terms of kind of something more concrete, like I said, I think it's something we're working on at the moment, and we want to put forward those recommendations. And we'd encourage people to tweet us as well, like if they've got thoughts, because I think that's what we want to do. You know, we want to hear from the sector, we want to hear from people working in those spaces so that we can put something quite comprehensive together and really shed some light and support the sector in making these really challenging decisions.
Yeah, and in terms of, I mean, I know I absolutely take your point about the us not producing the report today, and we've thought long and hard about it and had many quite difficult conversations. But I do think it's probably the right thing. But in terms of how, at this point, how would you want charity leaders to keep engaging with Charity So White as a campaign?
Yeah, really good question. I think at the moment, like I said, kind of following us on Twitter, really being able to give a platform to some of the organisations that are doing this work at the moment. It's not just Charity So White. I think, Runnymede Trust, I know, are coming out and launching a report this week, kind of looking at the impact of economic inequality that this crisis will have on people of colour. I know that there's some other organisations who are really looking at kind of gathering that research and giving a platform. So I think at the moment it is kind of making sure that, we're being listened to in this space and really considering those things, but also being able to really challenge in the same way that we seem to be challenging kind of the government and people in power on funding, and really challenging on making sure that we're bringing that kind of lived experience to the forefront as well. Is just as important at this time. And I think I just wanted to say that one of the things that we're section of our organisation, which is People of Colour Impact, is actually thinking about how we can support people of colour and BAME staff and volunteers who might be feeling socially isolated, maybe living on their own or needing support with finding jobs. So again, kind of building networks is another thing that we want to do together with People of Colour Impact and Charity So White. So I think, keep engaging with us is definitely the message, so that we're able to kind of really create that platform and highlight these issues.
Thank you. That's great, Camille. Thank you. So just one comment saying, I started by quoting a tweet about this issue not being important. I think this event has shown why it is. I hope the naysayers who aren't here will access the recording. Somebody said thanks for putting this on, and they look forward to the race report when the time allows. So thank you very much for that comment. So Camille, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we're going to call it, wrap this up now. Thank you again to Christiana for pulling this together so quickly. Huge thanks to all our speakers, to Vanda, to Becca, to Mubin and to Camille. And, a massive thank you to Nikki and Stephen for allowing us to use this incredible platform, fundraising everywhere. Anybody who's been watching can see what a great platform this is for this kind of online engagement, and really does enable people to not only kind of have access to really great speakers who are, coming to us from their own bedrooms, but also enabling people to did I say? I'm just Stephen. I'm so sorry, Stephen. I think I keep calling you Simon. Sorry, Stephen. No, which one? You are Simon. You're Simon. Stop it. Okay. I'm going to call it quits there. But thank you all very much for watching and for engaging with this. ACEVO's website, we're going to keep our members and other people up to date with what we're doing to support you all through this crisis. Check out the website, check out the Twitter feed. Please do let us know if there's anything we can do to support you during this time. I hope that you're all going to stay safe, and I hope that out of the back of all of this, we can use some of this crisis as an opportunity to to create a more equitable and inclusive sector. And that's certainly something that we at ACEVO are determined to keep pushing on. So thank you very much for joining us, and yeah, stay well. Thank you.